No, I haven't posted the recordings from the previous sessions yet, mostly because as it turns out, as I'm getting accustomed to my spring schedule, I realize there's very little breathing room from the moment we start on Monday morning to about when our lab is over on Wednesday. So I'm a little bit of a blur in that time frame. And so Zoom is ready. They've got them there. I just need to download them and then upload them to YouTube and then post those links. So it usually doesn't take very long. I just need a little bit of sit down on my computer in the office and just power that out. So let's go ahead and dig in. And Jemiah, I know you're online. Can you see the screen okay? If you can hear me, I guess that's the first question, right? Can you hear me first? Good, thumbs up, thank you. So I want to kind of go back a little bit. I want to take a look at this slide and complete a couple of thoughts here, because we kind of talked a little bit about taxonomy, right? And so kind of how we classify and organize organisms and things like that. But one of the things that we want you to do is to know the taxonomic flow from domain to species in order, because that is all part of our name, right? So that's kind of like, I kind of told you what your first name was, what your last name was, but what about the 16 different names in the middle, right? Now, most of us don't have 16 middle names because we're not like that rich and we're not royalty. But I guess rich people tend to have lots of names, right? So I guess the more the merrier. I guess there's no harm in that, I guess, right? It's just that when you need to initial something, I guess that gets a little tricky, right? You just do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so forth. So remember, just to kind of complete the thought a little bit, remember we said that our first taxonomic level was the domain one, right? And that was our question on eukaryote or prokaryote, right? Which one are you, eukaryote or prokaryote? And we kind of separated those out into two prokaryotic domains, right? Archaea and bacteria, and then one eukaryotic domain, that's eukaryote. That's where we are, right? And that's where we spend most of our time in biology. If you're up in this region here, you're probably looking more like a microbiology. So that's typically a separate class. And then at the bottom, we've got genus and species, right? So that is our specific epithet. That's our name, so to speak, right? Homo sapiens and things of that nature. But what about all the stuff in the middle? Well, there's a lot of stuff in the middle. Remember, we talked about how you're asking each individual question, right? Binary question. I think I went over the idea of we ask questions like, do you have a backbone? Yes or no. Like, are you a mammal? Yes or no. Do you eat meat? Yes or no, right? Are you a carnivore? Are you a herbivore? Yes or no. So you have all these different questions, and all those questions are the ones that are in the middle between domain and genus species. And so what those are, so you start off with domain. And of course we have kingdom. And then another division called the phylum. Then we have class, order, family, and then of course we have genus and species. Now this is in the order of growing specificity. So for instance, there's only one species in your genus species designation, okay? Now in the genus, there's multiple species, right? So for instance, in genus Canis, you've got lupus, you've got familiaris, you've got others, right? So there's multiple species in a genus, there's multiple genuses in genuses, genus, gina, anyway. I don't know what the plural is for that, but you have multiple genuses in the family level and so forth, right? So like when you look at species, then it's very specific. But when you look at, say, for instance, phylum, then there's a lot of stuff in phylum. So there's like a lot of things. And then of course, when you get a domain, there's just like a ton of things in there. So it gets more exclusive the further down you go. And one of the things we want you to do is to remember this in order, which is lovely, right? Isn't that sweet of us? But how do you remember this in order? It's very simple. just remember this for all you Felix domesticus lovers out there, or not, I guess. And you tell me if this is for you or not. So even if you're not a cat person, this is a little arresting because even non-cat people, I mean, kittens are just cute. It's when they grow up, that's kind of when they sort of turn into something else. A cat, basically, with all of its cattishness. Yeah, so this is how you remember it, right? Drunk kittens playing chase on freeways get smashed. Starting with the most inclusive at the top, right? Domain encompasses everything, and then you get more and more specific as you sort of whittle it all down to species. By the way, if you're wondering, this is actually how I remember it in order still today, right? So like when I'm trying to figure out, oh, wait a minute, does class come first or phylum come first? I explain chase on freeways, and then that's kind of how I work myself out. So these things don't just stick around until you know it. They generally stick around pretty much for the entirety of your life, basically. Okay. So I just kind of wanted to fill that piece in there so you could see the entire spectrum, right? From top to bottom, from domain all the way down to species and everything in between. And the reason why it's important to know that is because a lot of times, like if some of you guys get interested in biology and you want to go into things like zoology or something like that, a lot of times you spend a lot of your studies in one of these areas here. Like when I was in zoology, we basically pick obviously the animal kingdom, right? So you're in the kingdom Animalia, but we went through the different phyla in the animal lineage, right? So just like one phylum to another, to another, to another, and we just kind of characterized the organisms that were in that particular phylum. And so we worked a lot on the phylum level. Just to let you know also, just to kind of give you an idea of how this works out. A lot of times students don't realize this, but they oftentimes will use taxonomy without even knowing it actually. And here's a good example. Have you ever seen an animal that you're not familiar with? And you immediately look at it and you think there's something familiar about that. It's kind of I don't know what it is exactly, but it's kind of a dog-like thing, right? So it's kind of a dog-like animal. Not quite sure what exactly it is. I know it's not a house dog, it's not a wolf, it's not a coyote, right? But it's some sort of a dog-like thing, right? So, or like a bear-like animal. When you're thinking on that level, you're like, this is kind of bear-like or cat-like. That's generally thinking at the family level. That's usually where that level of organization is. And so that's kind of a very intuitive thing for us to do. So a lot of times we'll just intuitively, like even something we don't recognize, will intuitively automatically land right there at that family level. And that's a pretty common thing, common place to be. So when you're thinking like that, you're thinking taxonomically. Okay. So let's go ahead and then start talking a little bit about some of the big things that we need to take a look at. So first of all, one of the things that chapter 1 is really critical for is obviously laying down some of the groundwork, right, that we kind of build all of our science knowledge on. So that's one important piece of it. This is another one, right? So this basically sets the foundation stones of the motivation of biology. I guarantee you in the semester, you're going to get like, underwater in biology processes and mechanisms, and you're going to get deep in the weeds in all the details and the minutia of biology. And it's very easy when you're in there to sort of lose perspective and say like, wait, why are we doing this again? Because it's in the chapter, right? I mean, that's usually kind of the way we look at it. It's very, it's like, oh, well, because I have to, right? But if you recalibrate that, what I'd like you to do is kind of recalibrate that idea and think of it more like, not just why are you studying this, but why is the cell doing this in the first place, right? So when you're deep in the woods of metabolism or cell biology, you want to ask the question, okay, okay, I'm studying this because I have to, because it's part of the class. Okay, that's easy, right? Let's let that one go. But now ask the real question, right? So why is the cell doing this in the first place? Where is it going, right? I mean, is it just doing this for kicks and grins because it wants me to study stuff? Or is there a purpose? Is this going somewhere, right? You probably will have that feeling several times in the semester while I'm kind of up here yammering on, right? It's like, okay, is this going somewhere? It's like, it is, just stay on the train. Right, so the idea is in biology, everything is going somewhere. Okay, now the question is where, right? What are those destinations? I mean, you don't just hop on a plane, do you? And just randomly go somewhere. I mean, who knows where you're going to end up, right? You start with what? A destination, right? There is a place you want to go, and then you figure out how to get there. Biology is the same way. So where are you going in biology? Well, let's take a look at it. Let's cut straight to the chase. What is the ultimate goal of all biological organisms on the planet? What? Okay, survive. That's not the ultimate goal, but that's a good one. To reproduce, that's it. This is it. To reproduce. Every biological organism's purpose on the planet is to reproduce. That's the bullseye. Now, that's not the human purpose, right? We've got a lot of other stuff we weave in there that has a lot to do with just us, but I'm talking about biological organisms. The purpose of an organism is to propagate the species. That's it. Okay, now let's take a look at this, right? Let's take a look at us in particular. So if our biological purpose is to reproduce, then what do we need in order to reproduce? Okay, food. Excellent. Hang on to that one. Let's keep going. What else do we need? Think basic. Water, oxygen. So I'll tie that in with the food, water, oxygen. I'll tie those together as a group. We'll keep going. There's a lot of organisms out there that have food, water, and oxygen, and they never reproduce. So what do you need to be able to reproduce? Yeah, the reproductive organs, right? You need the mechanical capacity to do so. That would be helpful, right? Okay, that's great. How do you get those? Do you go down to Walmart and buy them? You don't want to do that, probably because half the time they won't work. And then you have to return them. And nobody wants to return your used reproductive organs. That sounds weird, right? That's one of those phrases where you can't really say it unless you're like in a biology class, because you probably get pepper sprayed anywhere else in the world. But anyway, okay, so how do you come by those? How do you get those? Okay, so you inherit them. Excellent. Keep going. So you're trying to say that I actually have my dad's reproductive organs? Okay, so how do I go from gene to organ? Cells, what about them? What? You have to develop them, right? You don't get them for free. You get the information, right? But you have to develop them. Well, here's the thing. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and develop my reproductive organs. But think about this. How do we all start off life? What do we look like when we first start out? Go way back. Way back. What are we? Oh, go even further back. You're getting closer. One. Everybody in this room started off as one cell. The zygote, right? So here's the question then. If you need to develop reproductive organs that you've inherited from your parents, not exactly the organs, but the genes, obviously, right? Then what do you need to do from one cell to, hello, I'm ready to reproduce? What has to happen in between that time? Multiply, which is a way of saying growth, right? That one cell has to become how many? A lot, right? Do all those cells do the same thing? No. You have to make decisions about who does what, right? So that's development. So in order to become reproductively capable, you need the mechanical hardware to do so. You need a plan to develop it, and you need time to grow that up. That's before you get to reproduction. So in order to do that, however, you start off with one cell and you get this, our bodies, right? Is that do you think that's a fairly simple process? Well, how complex do you think your body is? Think about it. Yes, sure, but think about it for the long version, which I'll give you, right? Right. I mean, how many cells do you think you have in your body? We already established that there's a lot, right? We've already established that they're not all doing the same thing. So think about this one for a second. This is like for A&P people, because you guys will go through cells and you'll see all these different things the cells are doing. Is your skin doing the same thing that your brain is? Is your heart doing the same thing as your lungs? Are your kidneys doing the same thing as your intestines? Is your liver doing the same thing as your pancreas? Is your blood doing the same thing as your white blood cells? No. That's a lot of cells we just rattled off, isn't it? They're all doing something different, aren't they? But they all basically weave together in sort of a harmonious song of physiology. Everybody's on key. Everybody's on time. Everybody does what they need to do. They're doing completely different things, but they are all sewn together. Like what? Like a tapestry, where every single thread is woven together perfectly to fit each other perfectly. So when you get into physiology, you'll realize just how complicated that is. What do you think that takes? That takes a lot of regulation. And what? When you say cells, that's where we want to pick this one up now. Who's behind all of this? Cells. In order to get growth and development, guess what you got to do? You got to organize yourself, right? So yeah, you got a big pile of cells. So you just got a big pile of cells. So now you have to organize it. You have to say, okay, you guys, you go over there and you become nervous tissue. You guys become skin. You guys become heart. And split up a little subset of you to become blood vessels. And you guys, you become this, and you guys become this, and you guys become this, and you guys become this. And then you will be the sort of the patriarchs, if you will, of the lineages of all the little cells that are in your system. What does that all take? Organization. So you need organization in order to develop and grow. And why do you want to develop and grow? Because you want to reproduce. So if you don't have cellular organization, you don't have development. If you don't have development, you don't have reproduction. You don't have reproduction. That's not a successful organism. We've already pinned down heredity, which I like. Lead with genetics. That's always my motto, right? Lead with genetics and everything else will follow. But there's another one now, the H word in here, right? So homeostasis, that's a big word. What does that mean? Well, homeostasis basically is a descriptor that defines the constant conditions that are maintained inside the body. It's a physiological thing. So if you think about all of the different variables and molecules inside your body, there's kind of an ebb and flow to them, right? So they can build into great abundance. They can sort of shrink back into relative shortages, but they can sort of wildly fluctuate if you allow them to, right? So a lot of your metabolites in your body, in the cell in particular, if you want to break it down to the cell level, are a lot like the stock market. We live in an era of the stock market that's actually quite well behaved. If you take a look at the history of the stock market, like in the 19th century, before we started getting like Wall Street and before we came up with all these mechanisms to sort of tame the wild beast, the stock market was a wild, wild creature. I mean, it would really peak, it would just trough catastrophically. And so a lot of times when we look at like the economics of the 19th century, there was like none of these socialist laws that we have now that help to kind of buffer some of that abuse to us. So in the 19th century, you would have catastrophic depressions. I mean, most of us think of the depression as the 30s, but actually there's been multiple depressions, actually some of them worse than what we went through in the 30s. Like in the 19th century, there were some very, very deep depressions that were just absolutely devastating. And a lot of times the market would follow those depression cycles. I mean, you would have a boom and then an enormous crash, and then everybody would be dirt poor for a long time. And then it would kind of climb back up and get crazy and wild again, and it would crash. And then, I mean, it would just wildly fluctuate. I mean, it was not for the timid. Now we're kind of used to it, right? We say, okay, let's just go ahead and invest in a bunch of mutual funds. And then what do? Go away. Just let it do its thing. Come back to it when you're ready to retire, and it's going to be there, right? Isn't that the way it works now? Well, that's only because what we've done is we put in measures to sort of buffer those wild fluctuations. So those measures to help buffer those wild fluctuations gives us then a kind of a safe way of playing in the market, right? That's like homeostasis. Homeostasis basically is regulatory mechanisms that keeps these wild fluctuations sort of in a constant range so that you can actually do biochemical business in the body. Why would you want to do biochemical business? Well, because the things that you have to do are things that the cell has to do. And when you're organizing the tasks the cell has to accomplish, the reason why you're doing that is oftentimes so that you can grow and develop. And why do you grow and develop? So that you can reproduce. Notice where everything leads to. But wait a minute. We left the best one for last. So this is great, right? We need to grow. We need to develop. But are you going to get those reproductive organs for free? What do you need to give in order to get that? Money, right? In this case, fuel, right? Energy. So if you want to grow, I mean, you want to get bigger, that doesn't come for free. What do you need for that? Money, right? Cellular money, fuel, right? Reproduction, is that free? No. You need to pay for that. Cell organization, is that one free? Nope. You need to pay for that too. So everything that you do costs, and it's expensive. It's kind of like living in dead right now, right? So you just learn how to not eat for a few days at a time so that you can actually, yeah, right. So just like, do I really need to drink water today? I don't think so. That's a little extreme, but right. So it all rests on a foundation of energy. This basically pays for everything. Which is one of the reasons why I say those energetic chapters, remember those ones that are the take-home for the take-home? They're important, so we don't do away with them. We still cover them. Why? Because our foundation is energy. Now, these are all things that you have to do. And by the way, an energy plan, and this is really, wait a minute. Am I though? Zoom is so good at telling me what I'm doing wrong. Okay. Maybe there's some other things. Let me just hold on one second. Just give me a, no, we're still recording. So that didn't change on me. And if it is this, then it should be muted. Okay. But anyway, an energy plan, and I always like to think of it in terms of economics, is important because what you do is determined by what you have. Okay, so for instance, I want a car. I've got one, thankfully. But what I do for a living determines what kind of car I have. Right? So I've got a 15-year-old Ford Escape. Now, if I wanted the Bentley, I would have to do something else. So the economics plan that I have chosen for myself has put limitations on what I can do. Okay? I can't go out there and buy the multi-million-dollar mansion because I don't have that kind of resource. That's not the way I've wired myself. Now, if I wanted that kind of money, I would have to do something else that gives me more resources so I can afford that. So what you have as your energy plan will dictate what you can become. Okay? And so that's important because all of these things require energy. And then, of course, if you don't get these, then you will not have the wherewithal to reproduce. So what does that mean? All of these taken together basically means that the ultimate goal in all biology is to reproduce. Everything in biology, everything serves that purpose. So when you're asking the question, where are we going with this? Well, where we're going with this is reproduction. Everything that your body does is for the purpose of moving you toward reproduction. Even who said survival earlier? Even survival is leading you toward reproduction. You are not instinctually wired to survive because, the biological gods, so to speak, want you on this planet. They don't really care. Matter of fact, if there are any biological gods, they probably see you more as food for the lion, right? They're probably a little different than a can of dog food to feed to the dog. That's pretty brutal. That's a very non-humanistic way of looking at human beings, by the way, but a very brutal biological way of looking at us. Right? So the question is, why survive? Well, the reason why you survive is for one purpose, because you'll live longer so that you can what? Reproduce. And if you can't live long enough to reproduce, that's a fail. And from a biological point of view, right? You haven't propagated the species. So these are all important questions. And these are all basically questions that we are all asking. I always refer to these as the big biological questions of life. You will hear me refer to these all throughout the semester because different chapters will be focused on different questions. Why are we doing this? Because this is the big biological question of life we have to answer. By the way, the cool thing about organisms, because remember we started off this discussion with diversity, right? We talk about the diversity of organisms that are out there and kind of our ability to sort of taxonomically sort of organize them all and that sort of stuff. Well, a lot of times the question comes, well, where does diversity come from and why is it there? Well, the reason why it's there is because for every single organism on the face of the planet, this is your direction. This is what you have to answer. You have to do this one successfully. How you get there is completely up to you. And so different organisms will have different strategies to answer different questions. We have an answer to the energy utilization. We've developed an energy plan that works for us. Bacteria have a different one. Plants have a different one. Does it work for them? Yeah. Does it work for us? No. But it doesn't matter. Because if we all manage to get across the finish line, it doesn't matter how we got there, as long as we get there. When you kind of leave it up to us like that, then that means you're going to have, a whole spectrum of different strategies of how to get there. Okay. And that's what biology is about. Biology is basically about studying how each organism has chosen a strategy to answer these fundamental big biological questions of life. That's what you're doing. So cell organization, we actually have a full cell chapter, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on these ones. This is kind of a little bit more of the unpack of that list. But we have entire chapters on these, so I don't want to bog down on these slides. I'd rather move on to chapter 2 and get to these chapters where we'll really unpack it and take a look at it. But we have an entire chapter on cell organization. We'll talk a little bit about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but this is basically just an organizational thing. Eukaryotes are notorious for that. We talked about energy utilization, right? So this is basically our energy plan. It is different between different organisms. Obviously, plants have a photosynthetic strategy. They make their own food. Animals don't, right? We have to consume our food. That is a major switch point in biology. It's what we refer to as autotrophy and heterotrophy. So an organism that is able to make its own food is what we refer to as autotrophic, self-feeding. So auto means self, trophic means like feeding. So it's like a self-feeder. That's like photosynthetic organisms and things of that nature. Heterotrophy, hetero means different, trophy means eating. This is different eating. That basically means we have to go out and consume our energy. We can't make our own, so we have to actually eat the energy. And so those are really two big watershed areas when we're looking at organisms that in a way that actually splits us into kingdoms. So this is one of those things that kind of splits us into different kingdoms. It at least kind of drives the wedge between kingdom Plantae and Animalia. Okay, is that autotrophy heterotrophy split. Okay. Homeostasis we talked about. You're going to get a lot of homeostasis, by the way. For those of you guys going on to AMP, how many of you guys, your next stop is going to be like AMP1 after 1111? Good for you for taking 1111, even though system-wide we're kicking 1111 as a prereq. You're going to be better prepared, trust me, because I've got some 2101 students right now in my 2101 class who did not take 1111 and they're struggling right now. But you're going to get a lot of homeostasis in AMP, okay? Because that's what you talk about in physiology. You talk about homeostasis, what's normal, and then what happens when it gets knocked out of normal, right? And then you treat it. So those maintain your internal conditions. Then you, of course, have growth, development, and reproduction. Typically speaking, growth, development, and reproduction are usually, when you take a look at them at a eukaryotic level, you're looking at something like embryology, which actually, if you take a look at development, if you ever have a chance to take a development class or an embryology class, do it, because of all of the biological processes out there, and this is just my personal opinion, the process of going from a single cell to a little baby that you're holding in the hospital or in the back of the taxi cab, I don't know where. Either way, it's all the same, right? That process and everything that's involved and the stuff that we've learned about all the things that have to happen and the decisions that have to be made. And I mean, it's a jaw-dropping, complex series of events that is just absolutely like, this is like incredible. Like just there's so much going on at the same time, and it has to like go on flawlessly in order to get a baby. And it's just amazing just how much complexity and how many variables are happening and changing and doing their thing all at the same time. And it all worked out perfectly. It's kind of like if I were to take all of you guys here and I were to have each one of you sing a song, just sing the first song that comes to mind. And you all started singing a song. That would sound like a bunch of noise, right? Because everybody's singing a different song and they'd be clashing with each other. But in development, it's like everybody's singing a different song, but it's actually all weaving together. It's like it's almost like 24-part harmony, if such a thing exists, in development, but like on a higher scale. I mean, the process to go from single cell to a baby is just jaw-dropping when you really look at it. It's like one of the most amazing things, I think, in biology. And get a chance to look into that, because it's really just, it's cool. And get past, we always say like, oh yeah, after so much time it starts to form little fingers or whatever. No, that's not the part I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, wait a minute, how do you know when you're starting to form this little ball of cells? How do you know what's going to be the head and what's going to be the butt, right? I mean, how do you know what front and back is? How do you make those decisions, right? And how do you start to form the brain? And how do you start to form the brain inside the cranial cavity, right? How do you form the bone around the brain? How do you know that the bone doesn't get formed somewhere else in these cells? How do you get everything aligned? All these different things that are happening, how do they all come in the same place at the same time flawlessly, so that your brain is inside your skull instead of somewhere in your butt cheeks, right? That's called thinking with your butt. Okay, that's not a thing, by the way. I just made that up, so just do whatever you want with that. And of course, heredity, that's my thing, right? Because I've already outed myself. I'm a genetics guy, so I have no shyness about that. So this is the king, because the idea of propagating in the species is to pass on your traits to the next generation, right? So basically, we bequeath our traits to the next generation. Hopefully, they get a good deal from us. Not always, but hopefully that's the case. And of course, that all comes into DNA. That comes into the genetics chapter. So we'll talk a lot about that. Okay. So that's that. So then we want to sort of shift gears a little bit topically, and we want to take a look at, now we've sort of looked at classification. We looked at big biological questions of life. So these are all going to be very important things as we move through the semester. The other big important thing is the hierarchical organization of the study of life itself. So this is basically kind of a hierarchy that we have, because biology requires foundation, right? So you can't just start studying cells without having some knowledge of chemistry. You can't start studying chemistry without having some knowledge of physics at some point, right? So you kind of have these layers of knowledge that sort of build on top of each other, kind of like sediments that are laid down in sandstone, right? So you have to sort of lay one layer on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And that's what gives you this hierarchical organization. So the question is, what we want to do is we want to basically strip it all the way down to that first layer. And so what is at that first fundamental layer? Well, the first fundamental layer that we have in the study of all life is the first level, which is the atomic level. And basically, when you take a look at the atoms level, the reason why you look at atoms, why you want to talk about atoms, is because everything in the universe is made of atoms with the exception of energy, right? So if you are matter, that is to say, by definition, you take up space, which we do right now, right? So you're a physical substance, then you are made and composed of atoms. That's true for us. That's true for the desk. That's true for living and non-living systems. Everything in the universe that takes up space, that is defined as matter, is composed of atoms, okay? And those atoms then, typically, when we want to go to the next level of organization, is we want to take some of those atoms and we want to start putting them together into combinations and into relationships with each other to form molecules. So a good example of that one would be this guy right here. Who's that? That's water, right? A fairly simple molecule. And a lot of molecules start off that way. They're simple. So water, carbon dioxide, things like that, right? But we're not quite ready to build cells yet, are we? Because we're not just made of water. We're made of other things. And so what we want to do now is start making more complex molecules, going into a region what we call macromolecules. These are what I refer to as the biological molecules. So we're all made of 4 different types of macromolecules, biological molecules. We have an entire chapter focused on those studies. So for instance, DNA is a macromolecule. We need that one, right? To give us the information of how to build this. We need a script, basically. And so that's our DNA. Proteins, basically that's just about everything in your body doing all the hard work as proteins. They are a ubiquitous type. Carbohydrates, some of us are drinking carbohydrates right now. And of course, lipids. Some of us are perhaps or have eaten lipids this morning or will eat lipids, right? So those are the macromolecules. And from those 4, we can assemble those into different arrangements with themselves to make the next level up, which is organelles. So organelles are basically membrane-bound compartments. They will be, yes. I do not have Mondays up yet, but probably Mondays and today's will go up at the same time. Because by the time we're done with lab, this one will probably be ready, and I'll probably dump both Monday and Wednesday up there at the same time. So these guys have a definable function. What is that function? You don't just do stuff, right? There's no such thing as busy work in the economy of the cell. Everything has cost, and energy is limited. So you don't just do stuff, right? There's no time waste apps that we all have on our phones. Everything has purpose and function and direction. Otherwise, it's out because it's just too costly to keep that around. So what is the function? It's one of those big biological questions of life. That's what these organelles are doing. Now, are they answering all of them? No. An organelle is only going to be tasked with one. Here's a good example. The energy ones, right? So some organelles will just focus on the energetic stuff, and that's all they do. But they're not answering the other ones. So they're not answering, like, you know, the heredity thing. They're not answering the growth and development thing. That's not their stick. They're just focusing on the energy plan, right? So they're just answering one biological question at a time. Other organelles will answer the other ones. So then cells basically is an assembly of organelles. And the cell, we oftentimes will define, you'll see this in just about every textbook and coming from every instructor. The cell is defined as the basic unit of life. Now, what do we mean by this concept of the basic unit of life? Now, a lot of times instructors will just kind of move on, right? They'll say, oh, the cell is the basic unit of life. Isn't that nice? Put that one on a Hallmark card and send it to your nerd friends, and let's move on to the next topic, right? No, right? Because a lot of times students will take a look at that and say the basic unit of life, that's great. I understand the words, but I don't understand what you mean, right? What does it mean to be the basic unit of life? Is it me right there? It's like, what does that mean? Here's what this means. When we say the basic unit of life, this is what we mean. That this is the smallest we can get and still answer all of the big biological questions of life. You have to answer all of them, not just one of them. The reason why the organelle is insufficient is because that organelle only answered the energy ones. It has to come up with a plan for heredity. It has to come up with a plan for other things, and it doesn't, right? The cell is the first one where it has the energy organelle answering that question. It's got the heredity organelles answering that question. It's got the organizational stuff going on. It's got all these other questions covered. And this is the first level where you're able to functionally answer all of those big biological questions sufficiently to the point where you can what? Reproduce. This is one of the first really big plateaus of life. This is kind of like one of those self-sustained things. As a matter of fact, the cell actually defines the smallest living unit that we can find. So a living thing that we are comfortable calling living will be about as small as a single cell. Beyond that, it's guts, cell guts, that is, right? It's just cell parts, organelles, all over the place, not alive. The cell is the first thing that exhibits what we comfortably define as a living thing. And that's the smallest you can get. Now, the reason why I say this is because typically speaking, when you're focused content-wise in a class on numbers 3 and 4, you are generally in Bio 1111. Welcome, right? Because we've got entire chapters on that. If you are in this area, you are usually in some sort of a chem class. If you're focusing on things like atoms and molecules, you're in some sort of a chem class, Chem 1 or Chem 2, okay? Especially when you're looking at this, which is a list, basically, of the elements of the atoms in the universe. If you look at macromolecules alone, like you focus like a laser beam on the 4 macromolecule groups and their chemistry, then you usually are in a biochemistry class, which is kind of like a shared custody topic between molecular biology and chemistry. Okay. But that kind of gives you an idea of where in this level of organization you would expect to find these topics versus the classes that you're in. So so this is for you picture people, all you visual types. So here you can see you've got your atoms level, your atomic level, you got oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. They come together to form relationships with each other to form molecules. And then those molecules will form larger molecules and macromolecules, like DNA, for instance, is our example of one of our macromolecules. Then the macromolecules will come together to form the organelle. So this is a mitochondria. We'll talk more about that one later on. And this is an organelle. This is the one that focuses on energy. This is the energy engine, the energy power plant of the cell. And then if you put a bunch of organelles together that does all those questions of life, then you got the full cell. This one looks like a neuron, actually. So that's for you visual types. Let's keep going, by the way, right? We're at cells, but let's keep on going. Now, if you basically take, what am I on here? So this is 4, so I'm on 5 now. So basically, if you take a bunch of cells and you batten them together, you're going to form what's called a tissue. And right now in 2101, just to let you guys know, if you're kind of interested, head in that direction, kind of what's going on in there. Right now, actually, we're getting ready to start our tissues chapter. So we relearn about the 4 major types of tissues in the body. And there's a lot of work that we do learning the tissues. This is like the building materials of the body, right? So we assemble all these cells into tissues. And then if you basically assemble these tissues together, you're going to form an organ. But we don't just have organs in isolation generally, right? The organs are typically associated with other organs. And so when you assemble a bunch of organs, and they all have a defined function, you've created an organ system. I want to give you an example of this one, just to kind of tease apart what we're talking about here. I want to take a look at the liver. Okay, so the liver is a good one. The liver is part of the digestive system, right? So in the digestive system, you've got your stomach, you've got your intestines, you've got your liver and your pancreas. Those are all part of the digestive system. And so you got multiple organs in the digestive system. That's why it's an organ system, right? Now, when you take a look at the liver itself is actually composed of several different types of tissue, right? So you have the liver cells themselves, the hepatocytes. They're the ones who do all the metabolism that the liver does. They do what liver cells do. So that's one type of tissue, okay? Then they also have connective tissue, right? Because there's like sheets of connective tissue because the liver has multiple lobes and you have to hold those lobes together with something. And so those sheets of connective tissue will hold those lobes together. So that's connective tissue. That's the second type of tissue. Then there's also vascular tissue, right? So you have blood vessels going through the liver. That's a different type of tissue. So there's a third type of tissue now in the liver itself, okay? And then you actually have blood going through there, which is actually a fourth type of tissue. But you have all these different types of tissues that basically assemble together and create what we know as the liver. Okay, so that's a perfect example of how tissues come together to sort of create the organ. Now, if you're at this level, tissues, organs, and organ systems, generally you are in an A&P class. That's where you are. An A&P class, if you're studying humans, probably you're in a zoology class or a comparative anatomy class if you're like studying animals and things like that. Okay. So here's what it looks like. So here's tissue. So this is basically neural tissue. So you can see you got neurons here. So this is a neuron, and you got all sorts of different things. So you got little tissue fibers here, you got little cells here. So all sorts of stuff going on. So this is your nervous tissue. This will come together with other types of tissue to form the organ, which is the brain in this case. That'll be added to other pieces like the nerves and the spinal cord to create the entire nervous system of our favorite friend, who will then be combined with other systems like the respiratory system, cardiovascular system, the urinary system to create our organism, which is our favorite campus mascot, our Canadian goose, which are difficult to avoid on campus and will probably get worse when we start to thaw out. So it's already a little tricky to avoid the little bombs, right? The little grenades that they leave behind, right? So it's a little tricky walking around campus like a game of hopscotch, right? And like, you know, it's like, especially like little diarrhea spots where it's like, woo, wait a minute, you need to go see a doctor because that's not right. So I don't know what's going on there, but just, yeah, take care of yourself. But, yeah. Right, so this is an organ. Now the organism is another major plateau, right? The cell was a plateau. The organism is also a plateau because the organism basically represents another leveling where we have individuality. All right, so an organism is a self-contained state where we have all the organ systems we need in order to do our business, okay? And we're capable of surviving. So that's another landing spot. But let's keep going, shall we? Because it gets better. Well, it gets bigger. Not necessarily better. Depends on your perspective. But let's keep going. Now, what if we have a bunch of organisms together, like for instance, in this room? Well, that's a population. So a population is basically a group of organisms of the same species. So in this room, there is a population of Homo sapiens. Here we are. Now, what happens if there are more than one population? Well, that forms a community. This is basically where multiple populations inhabit a habitat. So 1019 right now is our habitat. There's a couple of populations in here, right? So we have one population of Homo sapiens. We've got a second population of cockroaches. We've got a third population of spiders. You know, so there's 3 different populations there. Together, all 3 of us together, we form the and by the way, I haven't talked about like the population of bacteria. So there's probably a population of different types of bacteria that we don't see as well. But all of those together, all those populations in this area creates the community of 1019. Okay, so community is a multiple populations. Now then, when you have communities that interact with each other, and their non-living environment, and this is the kicker right there, the non-living environment part. That is an ecosystem. All right, so when you take a look at an ecosystem, you can basically say it's not just animals and plants interacting with each other, but it's also now we add in the non-living component of it. That is, say, like, for instance, we're interacting now with things like maybe rainfall, right? Or the amount of snow on the ground, or the nutrients in the soil. So we're interacting with our non-living environment. And so once you add the non-living environment component in there, you've got yourself an ecosystem. And so when you have multiple ecosystems then across the world all together, then you get what's called the biosphere. And that's the last stop. And the biosphere is better known as the Earth. So the Earth is composed of multiple ecosystems, which are composed of communities interacting with each other in an non-living environment. And the communities themselves are composed of multiple populations, which may or may not be interacting with each other. But at each one of these levels, what we see is an expansion of our capacities. So every time we level up, we get a new set of properties that we didn't have before, but it's not additive, right? So we don't, it's not a linear process. So when we level up, it actually is synergistic. So it's non-linear. So we actually get more than we think whenever we level up. That idea of getting more than we expect when we level up is something we refer to in biology as emergent properties. So this is like a synergistic sort of thing. So we're getting more capacity, more abilities, more capabilities when we level up than we could have predicted on a linear fashion. So it's kind of like leveling up in a video game, right? Only in this case, instead of just getting a little bit stronger, it's like all of a sudden now you just kind of get endowed with all these new superhero powers that like make you like amazing, right? So you didn't see that one coming, but you're thankful for it because now you can do a lot of extra stuff. Here's for you picture people. Oops, picture people. Right, so here you can have your population. Looks like we have some branch geese down here, but also a lot of other birds as well. Typically composed of multiple species generally, right? So we have Canada goose, we have a goldeneye, and so forth. These populations are going to come together in a community. So you can see multiple populations here. So you can have snow geese here. Looks like the white ones here are snow geese, and of course you have the Canadian geese. But not just the animals, right? We are animal centric. We tend to see the animals, but also remember that you also have populations of fish under the water. They're part of the story too. You also have a population of grasses, maybe different grasses that are here on this little beach strand here. You also have weeds of various types that are in there. That's going to be a population of weeds. You also have bushes that are back there. Those are different populations of bushes, trees, a different population there. And that's before you get to things like the insects that are flying around in here and things of that nature. So those are all different populations of creatures that are in this community. So in a community, we kept it simple. But in a community, like if you go out to something as simple as this, just like a little lakeside here, there's going to be like dozens and dozens of different populations that are in that community, some of which you can see, some of which you can't. But then all of those populations then are going to be forming the community, but then those communities in that spectrum are going to be interacting with each other. And as they interact with each other in their non-living environment, then they form the ecosystem. And so the reason why they showed this here as their ecosystem is because this is a major habitat, right? The montane habitat. But the reason why they showed this is because notice you're up here probably around, if you're here in Colorado, you're up there by the divide, maybe around the 11, 12,000 foot range is where about when tree line hits, at least in Indian Peak Wilderness. That's about where it hits, around that 12,000 foot range. And so you can see where the tree line is here, right? So you're down here by this little, lake or puddle or whatever it is, this little surf. And so you're in the trees, but you can see you're very close to tree line where the trees aren't growing. Now, what's happening there? Well, that's an interaction with their non-living environment. So the idea is the soil, rockish, up there is not amenable to life. You've got precipitation up there, that's non-living environment in terms of snow. So you have probably also nutrients, because typically rock is not very nutrient rich. So that's the reason why a lot of things don't grow in there. They have to break down and cycle with nitrogen cycle in there in order for it to be able to sustain. Like trees in particular, only the hardiest trees can live up there. But you have this sort of response to say, like, I can go this far, but no further. Why? Because of the environment. The non-living environment is not supportive for me being able to go up there and like grow at the top of the ridge peak on the divide itself. Right. So that's an example of an ecosystem. You pull those ecosystems together to create home, right? Which is 0. Okay. Any questions on that kind of organization? By the way, I know you guys are wondering, so where am I then class-wise? If I'm in population, community, all that sort of stuff. Typically, right here, if you're in this region, you're generally probably in, I would say, maybe bio2, because that's kind of organismal population look. But generally speaking, you're probably looking at an ecology class or an environmental science. That's probably where these are. Okay, topical shift. Ready? We're in classification, hierarchy, now shift, right? Hard shift. Hard shift with no transition. Let's go. Okay, so the nature of science. Now, we already talked a little bit about the nature of science, right? So I already laid down a lot of those philosophical underpinnings of the nature of science. And so I don't want to belabor those points too much more. I want to kind of focus a little bit more on some specific things we want to tease out. One of the things that we always want to keep in front of us is a couple of things. First of all, that oftentimes nature of science suggests that we've already talked about objectivity, right? We already talked about that one, and testability. But we oftentimes in science are designing this discipline to be able to observe the natural world. So remember always that science is looking at natural law. So science is designed to investigate natural law. That's what its goal is to do, simply put. And so we oftentimes will use observation and reasoning and logic to help us understand natural law. So notice we have natural law, natural forces. We just basically want to understand how the world works. That's the goal of science, okay? Now, one thing also to know, I mean, I don't know, some of you guys may know this or not, but in theological realms, there's another version of this. So there's There's also the term natural law that exists in theology. And just for sometimes folks will run into that every now and then if they're of a theological stripe. These are not the same, right? So the idea of when you run into the term natural law in theology, it is not referring to the same thing as how I'm using natural law here. Natural law is the laws of nature, right? The natural forces that govern how things work in nature. That's this usage of the term natural law. So sometimes I'll hear that from students, be like, is this the same thing as natural law from, it's like, no, you're thinking of the theological version of natural law. That's a different thing. But one of the things that we always start with when we take a look at these natural forces is kind of like this concept that we have of the static nature of the universe. That is to say that the laws are, number one, the laws are knowable, right? So that is one of the things that we say. They are knowable, and we are able, and they're definable. So we can know them and define them as long as we do our work to know them and define them. And the other thing is that the laws of the universe that governs nature and how we do things have basically existed for, well, ever, for the most part, right? So like what we enjoy now as the laws of the universe, we could go back 4.5 billion years ago and still enjoy the laws of the universe, okay, as we know them now. That is to say that they are unchanging since its inception. Now, this actually comes from, and it's an application of a concept that actually originated from geology. Called uniformitarianism, which in a geological application is that everything we see today is how it has always been. And so we can basically extrapolate that, right? So for instance, the slow creep of plate tectonics is the same rate roughly as it has always been in the distant past. That's uniformitarianism that's unchanging, right? So the rates of sedimentation have been the same in the distant past. So as far as we can go back into the past, things of that nature. So that concept, when you're looking at like laws of the universe, are absolutely not a problem, right? Because we have physical laws that sort of define the rules of the road in the universe, and those are certainly unchanging, and they have been since the beginning, right? So that's just the rules that everybody plays by. However, there is a problem, and sometimes scientists get a little sloppy in this one, where they want to apply uniformitarianism to other systems. That's not appropriate, right? So for instance, there are two systems in science. One, you'll notice, there is a system that is defined to be absolutely static. That is to say, it is what it is, and it never changes, and it always has been. Those things are like the laws of physics, right? The laws of the universe, the things where we can go to some distant part of the galaxy and it'll still be true, right? We're talking about like the laws of gravity, the Newtonian laws, the laws of relativity. We're talking about things like the laws of thermodynamics, right? The laws of physics that define the framework and the backdrop of life. Those are unchanging, and that's what we're talking about. However, there are also a set of things, not laws, but principles that are designed to be dynamic, right? They're designed to change. And sometimes scientists, especially the geologists, which is the reason why uniformitarianism is nonsense, at least from a geological point of view, geology is a dynamic process. All you need to do is go and watch Kilauea for a while, right, or Mauna Loa, or any of these active volcanoes to know that geology is a dynamic process. It's constantly happening. Sometimes it happens very quickly, just within volcanoes, right? Like Mount St. Helens. I mean, basically, you lost an entire north face of a mountain in like a fraction of a second, right? Huge. And then sometimes it's just a slow ooze, like in Hawaii, right? So just a little dribble of lava, and it's just kind of constant, like somebody left this faucet on, and it's just kind of dribbling out. Two very, very, very different processes, very dynamic processes. And so that has a lot of dynamics. So that is not uniform, like at all, right? The rates of what they're doing are drastically different. And so that is a dynamic process. So sometimes in science, we say, oh, well, it's convenient for us to think of this as never changing. It's like, well, it may be convenient, but it's not true, right? This is one of my pushback points with those soft spots, especially like in evolution, where it's like, well, wait a minute, you're saying it's constant, but it's not. We actually have evidence for that, right? I mean, so it's like all of these rates, for instance, I mean, they're not constant, because in one breath you say, you know, well, it took like forever for all of this to lay down, and that's fine, I understand that. But then you turn right around and you say, well, all the dinosaurs died in a very short period of time because of a meteor strike on the Earth. That's Chicxulub. So wait a minute, to me, that is dramatically different rates, right? One is the slow creep, and I understand that, but then one is a catastrophic event that reshaped the Earth, like into the point where you killed off the entire dinosaur population in a short period of time. So you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? So we know that catastrophe happens, which pretty much means that this is not true for things like geology, biology, speciation, because we know that they are dynamic in nature, okay? But the laws of physics, solid gold, platinum perhaps even, right? So there's a distinction to be made there. And I always want to point that out because this is a common misinformation. Matter of fact, every single person, like even like my colleagues or my professors, when they start to talk about the constancy and uniformitarianism, things like geology, I mean, I nail them. I'm like, well, you're kind of lying, aren't you? Because you'll admit to catastrophe at the same time to teaching non-catastrophe. You can't be both, right? So you can't say that the one doesn't exist and then turn around and say the other one happened, right? So you do know that. So I'm not saying that these aren't a thing, but I'm saying that it's more complicated than that. And sometimes we're not forthright with that. So, but we do need this in order to build this. And so when I talk about that constancy, I'm usually talking about those physical laws, those laws that define the fabric of our universe to such a degree that if they weren't true, it would be absolute chaos, right? True chaos in the universe. I mean, the universe would literally like unzip, and I don't know what would happen after that, but I mean, it would just like go on total meltdown, right? So these are like things, when I'm talking about uniformitarianism, are the laws that are set down, the pillars, the foundation stones that defines our reality. And if they weren't true, our reality would be completely like gone. I mean, we would have no clue what our reality would look like. Okay, that's what I'm talking about there. So we already talked a little bit about objectivity. I don't want to talk about that anymore, but what I do want to talk about is some of the rationale and the reasoning that we use in science. And we use a branch of logic in science. And if you ever have a chance to take a logic class, it's a lot of fun. Take it, because it does teach you how to think and think rigorously and think things through for difficult problems. So it's really, really fun. And a couple of things that we see from logic are two different types of reasoning. One is what's referred to as deductive, and one is inductive. Now, these are two primary ways that we think of in science. Now, deductive reasoning is probably the one you're most familiar with, right? So like if you think about science, you think about some kind of a guy who has an idea, they do an experiment, right? And then they say, well, my data supports my hypothesis, and so this is my conclusion that I was right, right? So you kind of think about that. That process is a deductive process. So what you're doing is you're taking general principles, or in this case, data, and from that, you're making specific predictions and conclusions, right? So that is a deductive strategy. Oftentimes in logic, and like debate, for instance, you'll see this come across and structured as a premise versus a conclusion, right? So a premise you set down would be kind of like a general principle or a statement of fact, perhaps. And then from that premise, if it's a good premise, then you can make a conclusion. So that is to say that your conclusion follows after the premise, and the premise supports the conclusion. Okay. Same thing here in science. The data supports your conclusion, right? And the conclusion follows from your data, right? Now, what happens if your premise is faulty and you make a conclusion anyway? That in logic is something called a non sequitur. That's actually a logical fallacy. And that basically means that your conclusion does not follow after your premise. Okay, it's not necessarily true from your premise. In society, we oftentimes use the term non sequitur. How many of you guys heard that one before? Non sequitur. Oftentimes people will use that incorrectly. They'll use it as a synonym for irrelevant. Oh, that's a non sequitur because it's irrelevant. No. You don't know what non sequitur means. It's not irrelevant. Non sequitur is a logical fallacy. It means the premise that you established does not support your conclusion. Okay, so it's a logical fallacy. Inductive reasoning is a little bit different. So inductive reasoning is basically born on the shoulders of lots of observations. So for instance, there's a legal version of inductive reasoning called preponderance of evidence. Anybody heard that term before? Nobody? Oh, those defense attorneys, they got their work cut out for them. So preponderance of evidence is a legal thing. And so basically it goes like this. I think you committed a crime. You say you didn't. But I've got evidence to suggest you did. Now, it's not hard evidence, it's circumstantial. And one little piece of circumstantial evidence does not prove that you're guilty, right? Two pieces of evidence, circumstantial, does not prove that you're guilty. 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of circumstantial evidence, the more you get, the more likely it is you did it, right? Because an innocent person might get pegged, just unluckily, with one piece of circumstantial evidence, but if they didn't actually do the crime, that's probably going to be it. Somebody who did it may have covered the tracks really well, will have this whole list of circumstantial evidence, where neither one piece is good enough to convict, but all of them taken together sort of starts to create this heavy weight. And it's like, you know what, a guilty person or an innocent person would not have had this many coincidental, unlucky circumstantial evidences against them. Only somebody who's slippery and who's trying to get away with it who actually did it. Right? That's called preponderance of evidence. Any one piece does not convict you, but the more of it you have, the more it weighs down on you, and the more likely it is that you did it, because if you didn't do it, that wouldn't have so much weight on it. That's preponderance of evidence. So it's based on observation, right? Here's another good application for inductive reasoning. I want you to do something. I want you to do an experiment. I want you to go outside, and you may not even have to do this, perhaps. And I want you to tell me, what color is the sky? Well, not the actual sky. Not the clouds in the sky, not the fire smoke in the sky, the actual sky itself. What color is it? Blue. Did you have to go outside for that one? No, if I send you out tomorrow and I ask you what color is the sky, what color is it going to be? The day after that, what colors are going to be? Yesterday, what color was it? So if I ask you, life or death, you get this one wrong, it's certain death. What color is the sky? And you guys are feeling pretty good about that one, right? You're like, yeah, I get to live today. Right? So why are you so confident? I mean, you didn't go out there and look at it. No, it's nitrogen. It has to do with nitrogen and the way nitrogen scatters light, which is most of our atmosphere. Mhm. Even over land, which is the reason why it's not a reflection. So you guys seem pretty confident. Has the sky ever not been blue? How many times have you seen the sky in your lifetime? Millions? Depends on how much you spend outdoors, right? Millions, perhaps billions even, right? I mean, depending on how old you are. I mean, since the time you were little, how much time you spent outside. I mean, we're talking billions of times and over a lifetime, perhaps even trillions of times. Of all those billions and trillions of times you've looked at the sky, the true sky, not the clouds, not the debris in the sky, the true sky, the daytime sky, not the nighttime sky, has it ever not been blue? No. And you're pretty comfortable in that one, right? So much so that if I give you the life and death ultimatum, you're comfortable with saying blue, right? So what you've just done is inductive reasoning. You've made a conclusion. What's your conclusion? The sky is blue. Why? Did you do some sort of an experiment to test it? No, it's just over the observations that you made, the billions and trillions of observations that you've made, you've never seen the alternative. It's never not been blue. That's inductive reasoning. So your conclusion is that it is blue because you are inductively reasoning. That's how you know it, because of the weight of the observation. The more you see it as blue, the more likely it is actually blue. Okay. If you see it once as blue, are you going to say, "Hey, it's blue"? Well, maybe I just kind of caught it on a weird day. You know, maybe it's actually pink, right? Or red. But then you go out the next day and it's like, no, it's blue again. So I'm feeling a little more confident. It's not pink or red. And it's like, you go out again. It's like, no, it's blue a third time. Now you're feeling more confident, right? So after a few observations, then you're going to start feeling comfortable saying, listen, I'm so comfortable with this now that I'm willing to stake my life on it. I'll tell you it's blue. Okay, so that's inductive reasoning. Science also comes in two flavors. Typically, we have two different versions of science. We have interpretive and descriptive. Most of what we focus on especially in 1111 is descriptive science. So descriptive science basically tries to explain or describe nature. You look at stuff, you try to describe it, you try to explain it. However, what does interpretive science do? Interpretive science basically tries to sort of go back and reason and try to make inferences based on it, right? I mean, a good example of this is kind of the description of kind of the way we look at origins, right? So when you take a look at origins, you've got descriptive stuff. You got stuff in front of you, right? So you've got some things, fossils perhaps even as a good example. And so you've got descriptive science. So there's a descriptive level of this. So what are you looking at? Well, I'm looking at a bone. It's not a hippo. It's not an elephant. I don't know what it is. It's something else. And I'm going to sort of describe what I see and try to wrap my arms around it. Now, the interpretive component of that goes when you're trying to understand the relationships between this bone and this creature, and then the other creature you dug up in the same rock right next to it. And you're trying to understand ancestral relationships. Why? Because you're going back in time into a place that we can't test or know for sure. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to make inferences, right? Interpretive inferences based on the descriptive stuff. And you're trying to put that together to try to make inferences from the stuff that you've described. Okay, so interpretive science is a little bit tricky, and that's what kind of we're talking about when we're talking about evolution. There's a descriptive piece of it that's really interesting and fascinating. It's easy to understand. We have no problem with that one. And then there's the interpretive part where we start to go back in time to try to infer those relationships interpretively. And that is where you kind of start getting a little wobbly and we're not quite sure how it all puts together. Okay. Most of what we focus on, especially at the cellular level, is descriptive. And we wrap this around a couple of major things. So observations is a key one. And then, of course, hypothesis is another. And so this brings us to our other pillar of science, right? We said objectivity is one pillar of science. The other pillar of science is testability. Every hypothesis has to be testable. And that's true for science. Not really true for the other disciplines, but it's true for science. So a lot of what we're doing in science, and actually science at its most powerful, I would argue, is when we are describing the world around us and how it works. And how do we know that's a powerful thing? Is most of the research that has underlied medical advancements has been largely descriptive. How does this work? And then how can we get this to work for us, to help us get over this disease? or to treat this particular problem. So a lot of descriptive science underpins a lot of our technological advances. So we already talked about deductive and inductive reasoning, so I don't want to beat those guys up. Now, what I want to do is I want to get into the scientific methods. So this is actually a big deal. Why? Because remember, we talked about 3 disciplines of thought, right? We talked about philosophy, we talked about theology, we talked about science. Science is unique between those 3 because it limits itself and it kind of organizes itself differently. Science is also unique in the sense that it has a methodology. The others don't, or hadn't until science came up with it, right? So that's a game changer, actually. That really sets science apart. So here's the methodology. The methodology is a scientific method, and it's basically a process that was designed and kind of put together through multiple researchers and things like that to help us rigorously and systematically study the hard questions of nature, the complicated questions of nature that we're trying to answer. Okay, it all starts off with an observation. And what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of an example, kind of an analogy, kind of running alongside it so we can kind of illustrate it a little bit. And so what I want to do is I want to introduce you to 2 individuals. They're 2, and we're going to put them back, not in current time. We're going to put them back, way back. Let's put them back in the Dark Ages. Okay. One of them is a young, budding, curious scientist type of a person. And by the way, Dark Ages is pre-Renaissance, so it's pre-science. There wasn't really science around at that time. And the other one is like a poet. Now, one of the things about the Dark Ages is even though they didn't have science really to any degree, I mean, they had alchemy, but that was just kind of snake oil science at the time. They had probably some astronomy going on, but they didn't have science as we know it, right? They didn't know anything biologically like the way we know it now, or chemistry really. Alchemy was still kind of, they still thought they could turn lead into gold. I mean, that was a rude awakening when they figured that one out, right? So we didn't know a lot about science back in those days, but they did know one thing well. Their education system was formed around learning philosophy. So if you went to school back in those days and you had means, you would learn things like philosophy. You would learn like Greek philosophy. You would learn literature. So you'd learn about all the Roman poets. You'd learn about Plato and Aristotle and all the greats, Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, all that. So you'd learn all of literature and things of that nature, or theology. That would be another big one, right? Because that was kind of the heyday of the Catholic Church, especially in Europe, right? So you'd probably learn, that would be your education, right? That's the degrees you would get: philosophy, literature, theology, things like that. Art, right? Sculpture, painting. I mean art broadly, not just like, but everything. So music, painting, sculpture, everything artistic. That was another big thing that you probably learned a lot about as well. So here's these 2 individuals, the scientific guy and the poet, both of which have this sort of humanities, right, are letters, kind of a background of teaching, philosophy, art, and things of that nature. They go for a nature walk, and what they're going to see is they're going to see a plant. And they notice the leaf. And what color is the leaf? Yeah, so they just made an observation. Now, there's a step in here that I'm going to add that isn't on this list, but it's a necessary step. So remember, both of them, the poet and the science guy, see the same leaf. They make the same observation. What they do with that is what sets them apart. The poet will then kind of wax philosophical, and they'll be like, what is green? And start writing an ode to the leaf, right? And then we'll read about that in literature class. But the science person asks a different question. The science person is going to ask what question? Yeah. Why is it green? Now, not the philosophical capital W why. Why is it green? Right? It's not that. The question you're really asking is, how does it work? Right? How does it work that this is green and the poinsettia that I've got at home is red? Or the poinsettia at home has green leaves on it and red leaves, or white leaves, depending on which one you got, right? So you got questions. How does this work? That's a difference in question. Now, The scientific process, the next scientific method process is hypothesis. The hypothesis is very easy to do. All it is simply your best guess to your question. Notice I didn't say the correct guess. It's your best guess. The point of the hypothesis is that this is your best educated answer to your question based on what you currently know or what you currently don't know. Now let's take a look at our friend here. This person had a classical education from the Dark Ages, which basically means this person probably knew a lot about things like art and paint and pigments and things like that, but nothing about science. So for this person, the only information they've got from their education gives them a hypothesis like this. Maybe it's paint. Maybe it's painted. Notice, it's your best answer based on what you know, not the correct one. We obviously laugh at this one, yes? But not if you didn't know about pigments in plants. And if all you had about pigments in plants was paint, that's all you got to work with. Remember, the important thing about a hypothesis, and when you guys go through lab, they'll ask you for predictions and hypothesis and stuff like that in the lab manual. Remember, the hypothesis never has to be correct. It just has to be testable. That's it. So that takes a lot of pressure off of that one. Now, from the hypothesis, you should be able to make testable predictions. Well, let's take a look at this one here. There's two different predictions, and there's usually two different predictions. There are usually if-then statements. So the first one is if it's paint, notice the if-then. Then it should rub off. Rub off with what? Yeah, you're an artist, right? So if you're thinking it's watercolor, it's water. If it's oil, you're probably looking at paint thinner, right? But you have all these different paint solvents that you can try out. And if it's paint, I should be able to remove it because I've learned about chemical ways to remove paint. That's part of my education. However, what's the alternative? If not paint, then it will not rub off. Notice the two if-then statements. Now what do? You rub it off. Right? You go grab something, water if you think it's a watercolor base, or paint thinner if you think it's oil based, right? Depends on what you're going for. There's multiple ways you can go about this. And what do? You try to rub it off. And what do you see? Did it rub off? So what's your conclusion? Not paint. Let's say we used water and we assume, first of all, that it was water-based. So I'm going to go with the first one that you mentioned, right? So not paint. But if we used water, we're saying not paint. That is to say not watercolor. But now you've got questions, don't you? Wait a minute. Is it oil? Notice a question. So you just got a question from your data, didn't you? You rubbed it with water, nothing came off, so you now know it's not watercolor, but now you're asking the question, wait a minute, is it oil paint? Now you go right back to number 2 and do the exact same thing. And generally speaking, when you do an experiment, you usually generate more questions than you answer. And those questions feed right back into the question level of the scientific method. And oftentimes scientific method can be very iterative like that. It can kind of keep cycling because you generate all these questions, you want to answer some of those questions. And the more times you go through it, the more experiments you do, you learn a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and it just keeps on growing and growing and growing. And just kind of go where your data takes you. That's oftentimes what you do. So it's kind of like a pretty version of it, right? So here you kind of have, here you did have the question piece of it. So here you have an observation, make a question. You come up with 5 alternative answers. So I don't know what it is. It could be any one of these 5 answers. And then you do an experiment that excludes, there's not consistent with 1 and 4, so you can eliminate those. You do another experiment that's not consistent with 2 and 3, so you eliminate those. Then you have 5 standing. And you can generate predictions from 5, do a couple of experiments. And if these experiments are consistent and the predictions predict the outcomes of the experiments, then you can say that it looks like if I confirm my predictions, then it looks like 5 is looking pretty good. That maybe I have the right answer. And that's kind of how you do it. You just kind of like keep going through it. It's a process. And you just kind of keep sort of chipping away at it. You learn a little bit at a time. Right? It's not like you've taken a whole chapter. Like one chapter in your textbook, one chapter is probably lifetime's worth of research. So think about that. You have an entire textbook like that. So you're talking about thousands and thousands of lives, careers that basically went into making that one textbook. So we basically have our hypothesis. So we're always driven around our hypothesis, which will spit off our predictions. And so you always want to make sure your hypothesis is testable. If it's not testable, then it's a hypothesis. It's a model, right? So it's your best shot at trying to get the answer. But that's where that interpretive piece comes in, right? So it kind of gets a little shaky there. The other thing is iterative, right? So basically you want to make sure that your hypothesis improves. And so what we mean by iterative is that the hypothesis should be able to improve with more experimentation. So imagine that we have a hypothesis, we do an experiment, and our experiment is like, you know what? My experiment seems to be consistent with part of my hypothesis, but there's a part of my hypothesis that wasn't consistent with my data, right? Especially like if you have a more complicated hypothesis, like a model or something like that, right? And we'll talk about models here in just a second. So what you want to do is you want to say, well, maybe if I do another experiment, I can sort of figure out or modify my hypothesis because my data doesn't seem to fit my entire hypothesis. A part of it seems to be correct. I'm like half right. I'm like halfway there. But then if I do another experiment and I modify my hypothesis, like, well, I got half of this right, so I'm going to go ahead and change this piece that doesn't seem to be fitting with my data. I'm going to try that. And then I run another experiment to see if it's consistent with that. So you kind of keep tweaking it. You run an experiment and you kind of take the pieces that are inconsistent with your hypothesis and you tweak your hypothesis. And you kind of keep doing another experiment and you just kind of keep modifying. It's like kneading dough, right? When you're making bread, if we ever do that again, but in life, but like when you're making bread, I mean, initially when you're first mixing it together, it's not ready, is it? I mean, kneading dough, making bread is a process. So if you start out, it's kind of crude. Part of it looks like it's good, right? And doughy and it's ready to be made in bread. But there's a part of it's like, yeah, I got to work that part in, right? So what do? So you work on that part that's still kind of a little floury or a little unneeded, and you kind of like are working on that area. The rest of this is fine, but you got to keep working on that one area. And then there's another pocket that you find, you got to work on that one, right? So you kind of work it all out a little bit at a time. That's the iterative process. And you're going to only do that if you're honest enough to say, you know what, my hypothesis isn't spot on. I'm not expecting it to be. But over the course of time, with a little bit of academic honesty and objectivity, I'm going to admit that I didn't get it all right and that I need to keep sort of kneading the dough, so to speak, in order to kind of get it to be a little bit more accurate and a little bit more accurate, a little more accurate. And if I'm honest with that process, then you're going to come out with a stronger idea than not. By the way, that process of having to sort of constantly modify and update your idea is typically something that's required. This is the reason why I say don't fall in love with your idea, right? Because if you fall in love with your idea, your hypothesis, then you put yourself in a position where you're not willing to admit that your hypothesis needs kneading. Instead, what you do is you defend it as is, and you say, well, I don't care what the data says, right? I know this is the way it works. So there's something wrong with your data. It's like, that's not a healthy perspective. right? That's becoming non-objective. That's how you know you're falling in love with your idea. If you're not willing to go back to the drawing board and knead it and work that dough, then you're not being honest. You think you have good bread, but nobody's going to eat that, right? And you're going to lose your job as a bread maker at the bakery, right? So that's basically one of the reasons why I say that. Don't fall in love with the idea, because you have to be honest with yourself. And you have to say, listen, I'm not in love with my idea. I just want to know how it works. So yeah, the whole thing could be wrong. That's okay. I just want to get closer to being right, whatever that means, right? So I just want to know where it's wrong so I can fix it and do more experiments so I can figure out whether or not it's like, well, now did I get it? Right. So that's what should drive a healthy scientist. Okay. Not dying on a hill saying their idea is correct. And unfortunately, I see a lot of that defense, and it's not healthy. So basically, one of the things we need to make sure is that when we do a hypothesis, what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically reject the ideas that are inconsistent with data, right? So the idea is like the prediction. Say, if this is the way it works, then we can predict that this should happen, right? And if it doesn't happen, then it's inconsistent with your idea, and it suggests that your idea needs modification. Not that the data needs modification, but that your idea needs modification. That you're close, you're not quite there yet, but you need to change it. That's basically what we're talking about with testability. Okay, so let's take a look at the experiment process itself. So whenever you do an experiment, not only do you need a hypothesis with testable predictions, but you also need to organize your experiment so that you can basically define one variable at a time. Okay, so ultimately what you always want to do in an experiment is create an experimental group and a control group. So this is what's called a controlled experiment, and that's necessary. So when you take a look at the experimental group and the control group, they are exactly the same with the exception of the variable that you're testing. Here's an example that I want to leave you with, and I'll probably finish up with this, and we'll kind of pick up when we kind of pick up on Monday, I guess, at this point. So imagine that that you guys are a bunch of farmers, wheat farmers perhaps, and I'm trying to sell you some fertilizer. My claim is that if you buy fertilizer, you're going to grow 10 times more yield than if you were not to use it. And in order to do so, I'm going to show you an experiment. So in order to actually make this valid, what I have to do is set up an experimental group and a control group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a plot of land. One is going to be the experimental group. The other one's going to be the control group. And everything about this is the same, right? Soil, the same. Rainfall, the same. Sun, the same amount of sunlight, all the same, right? All the variables are the same. The only difference is in this plot, I've either got fertilizer, and in this one, I don't. So when we grow the wheat, this one grows more robustly than the other one. From this, we can safely conclude that what caused the excess growth? Why? How come not the soil? Because everything's the same, right? So when you control for it, you can say, like, I know what your pushback is. You're saying there's more nutrients in the soil over here. No, the soil is the same. Oh, you're saying there's more rain over here. No, the rainfall is the same. Oh, you're saying there's more sunlight over here, so it's going to grow bigger. No. They're saying the sunlight's the same. All the variables that would affect this are all the same. That's what control and experiment do. They're all the same. The only difference is I put fertilizer on this side, and there's no fertilizer on this side. So when you control for all the variables, you isolate whatever your effect is that you're studying to that one variable. That makes your conclusion of it is the fertilizer that's doing this more robust and more accurate. If you're able to do that in a well-controlled experiment, it typically has greater strength to help you define, is my hypothesis correct or not? Because if I don't have all these variables controlled for, it could be rain, sun, soil, it could be anything, but I don't know. This way it's controlled. That's critical. So we'll run into controls after. So I will go ahead and pick up with reductionism next time. So